As the night begins to come on, the sun has set. This is really a transition gateway episode into the night. They're going to see, I think both Gertie and Bloom notice this bat that is flying. What is the significance of this bat? I'm tempted to connect it with that motif of Bloom as this kind of dark figure, dark animal of the night, a panther-like figure. You can also see that similar to a bat. So finally, as night comes on and he connects with Gertie McDowell, he's finally able to fly free at last like that bat. The perspective shift to Bloom in my edition takes place on page 367 at the bottom. Tight boots? No, she's lame. Oh. And a poor girl follows soon thereafter, because this is Bloom. We're settling in his mind, and he always has that sense of pity about people. Another mystery you may have noticed is, you remember in the morning Bloom was heading to the Turkish baths, and his plan was to masturbate there. Why didn't he?
Damned glad I didn't do it in the bath this morning over her silly "I will punish you" letter.
I think Joyce is enjoying the fact, the retrospective arrangement of it all, that because he didn't show that scene, he doesn't have to follow that initial plan, that initial intention of the character. Here's a great line from Bloom connecting his sense of fate and his sense of the magical coincidence. When you feel like that, you often meet what you feel. Bloom wonders what it is that Gertie saw in him. Saw something in me. Wonder what? Sooner have me as I am than some poet chap with bear's grease plastery hair, lovelock over his dextered optic. Well, we have seen what Gertie saw in Bloom, and it wasn't accurate at all. He's not an exotic foreign gentleman. He's from Ireland, from Dublin, and he's not at all how she imagines him. But does it matter? There's a lot in this episode about Bloom's watch, which seems to have stopped around 4:30, and he wonders, is this the time when Molly and Bloom were having sex? This sense of coincidence and timing and the magical is we've seen throughout the book, but it's superstitious in some ways, but it's also this lining up of gears. Also, every now and then he seems to have a pang and re-realization of the fact that they've had this affair. Oh, he did. Into her. She did. Done. Ah. But we also get something we've had hinted at before, that Bloom has been with prostitutes, and you may be tempted to say that these prostitutes were from before he was with Molly, that from his younger days. But Joyce makes it clear, he seems to have anticipated that argument. He makes it clear that they are when Bloom is a married man. Girl in Meath Street that night. All the dirty things I made her say. All wrong, of course. My arcs, she called it. It's so hard to find one who... Oh, if you don't answer when they solicit, it must be horrible for them till they harden. And kissed my hand when I gave her the extra 2 shillings. Parrots. Press the button and the bird will squeak. Wish he hadn't called me sir. Oh, her mouth in the dark. And you, a married man with a single girl. That's what they enjoy, taking a man from another woman. So your image of Bloom may have changed. Maybe you no longer see him as a sympathetic character, that Molly's the betrayer. He's done similar things. I prefer to see Joyce expanding the definition of Bloom's humanity and showing that he is not perfect, Molly's not perfect, and that being able to not judge them and just see them as they are, expanding perhaps our definition of love. I think Joyce would be fascinated by the variety of and possibilities of relationships nowadays, how we still have at one end of the spectrum very traditional marriages where things are very clearly defined, and at the other end of the spectrum we have like polyamory and all that, how that all coexists. We have this much broader spectrum of pretty much every possible relationship you can imagine between 2 or more people. Very important detail I noticed I never noticed before. Bloom thinks, French letter still in my pocketbook. A French letter, I learned, is a condom. So if you thought that maybe they did not have condoms back then to prevent pregnancy, and maybe that's why, if your thought was that Bloom was not sleeping with Molly, I mean, actually he is literally sleeping with her, but they're not having sex because he did not want to risk getting her pregnant and dealing with the pain of losing another child again perhaps. He also wonders about having sex on a woman's period, safe in one way. So he clearly sees not getting her pregnant as something safe and desirable. So you have to wonder why he doesn't use condoms with Molly. At one point, Bloom thinks, do fish ever get seasick? Not only is this funny, but it's one of those things I always imagine how these characters would be nowadays. And Bloom seems like the type of person who would be constantly Googling shit to find out why things are the way they are. He just has endless curiosity. And by the way, I did search to see if fish get seasick. And apparently, according to some researchers, or what the internet has led me to believe, some fish do get seasick, and also that there are researchers whose job it is to get fish seasick. We'll get some more references to Molly's youth. She grew up in Gibraltar in Spain. We're going to talk about that more, but her father was stationed there in the military. When we get to Penelope, I'll talk about not only that and Molly's lovers. Bloom is thinking at one point, what if Gertie is the author of the letter from the Martha Clifford letter? Bloom actually hears the other girls refer to her as Gertie, but he wonders maybe it's a pseudonym like his Henry Flower pseudonym. Still, it was a kind of language between us. It couldn't be. No, Gertie they called her. Might be false name, however, like my name and the address Dolphin's Barn of Blind. She's not a bad candidate, but I'm still leaning towards Miss Dunn. Someone once said something like, we know more about Leopold Bloom than any other character in fiction, even the fact that he is uncircumcised. Well, the foreskin is not back. Better detach. Ow! Another interesting example, similar to Bloom not masturbating at the Turkish baths, is this kind of a rewriting our expectations, because we realize we filled in a lot of the information. But you remember at Aeolus when Bloom was leaving the newspaper office and the newsboys were, after he had passed, they were kind of imitating his walk behind him. We didn't, I think it's natural to assume that Bloom didn't see that. But finally, in this episode, much later in the book, we learned that he did see that, he knew about it. And that just totally changes our understanding of that scene, that he was aware of them making fun of him. There are some references to Matt Dillon, where the house of a friend of theirs, Molly and Bloom, when they were much younger, and Bloom is recalling when he kissed Molly. And there's also some reference to the City Arms, or the City Arms Hotel. This is a hotel that the Blooms stayed at, they lived at for a while. One thought that Bloom has that I think is really very insightful, he's thinking of something that Molly said. He had asked her, why him? Why did she choose to marry him? Why me? Because you were so foreign from the others. I talked before about Bloom, his sense of identity, whether he really is a Jew. And I think you can also ask something similar with Molly. Is she really Irish? You know, her father was Irish, but she grew up in Spain. I think she didn't come to Ireland until she was like a teenager. So is she really Irish? By the time she arrived there, it's easy how she could have seen that the people there weren't necessarily her people. They seemed very foreign. So she felt like a foreigner. And seeing Bloom, who is an outsider, even though he grew up there, seeing him as an outsider may have allowed her to relate to him in a way that she couldn't to this Irish culture that she said she was told was her culture, but how much could she really relate to it? There is some talk about sailors. This makes me think of Odysseus, of course, who is at sea for so long, but it also brings to mind a character we will meet in the Eumaeus episode, a sailor. Early on in the book, we heard a reference to a woman named Mrs. Purfoy who is giving birth that day. She's been in labor for a really long time, very painful, protracted labor. And Bloom is wondering how she's doing, and he thinks, I should stop by the hospital and see how she's doing. So that is going to lead into our next episode, Oxen of the Sun, and he will visit the hospital, where, coincidentally, Stephen will be. I found another wonderful parallel between Bloom and Stephen. As he's on the Sandymount Strand on the beach, he thinks, All these rocks with lines and scars and letters. This reminds me a lot of Stephen that morning, who said, "Signatures of all things I am here to read, sea spawn and sea rack, the nearing tide, that rusty boot." Another riddle coming your way. Bloom at the end of this episode writes in the sand a message, maybe for Gertie McDowell, or who knows, but he writes, "I am a," and then he runs out of room and he doesn't complete the thought. What was he going to write? Who do you think, how is he going to characterize himself? Does this have to do with that multifaceted aspect of identifying as something, I am something? Or is it something simpler? And is this somehow a metaphor for Bloom's need to communicate to the world, but his kind of frustration in doing that? A really wonderful paragraph near the end of this episode. The prose seems to have almost be melting into this really syrupy mix of memories, and it really brings to my mind that song, you remember, The Lovely Seaside Girls, those girls, the line, "Your head, it simply swirls."
Oh sweetie, all your little girl white up, I saw dirty brace girdle made me do love sticky we too naughty grace darling she him half past the bed met him bike hoses fillies for older perfume your wife black hair heave under him bone senorita young eyes mulvey plump bubs me breadvan winkle red slippers she rusty sleep wonder years of dreams return tail end are gone death swoony lovey showed me her next year in drawers return next in her next.
The episode is going to end with this sound effect of a cuckoo clock, this clock in the house of this priest. I think it's the priest that was at the temperance retreat. And it is going to ring 9 times, so we know it is now 9 o'clock. And it concludes with a reference to Gertie seeing Bloom as cuckoo. And what does this mean? Does it mean that he's like a cuckold? Does it mean that he's cuckoo like crazy? I'm going to leave that for you to decide. But it seems to be maybe some kind of shift in how Bloom is perceived by Gertie. No longer maybe as exotic, who knows? This episode has been a wonderful examination of the concept of genre. We've seen that elsewhere in the book, but never longer than this episode. We're starting to see, though, that this is becoming a genre unto itself. This is, in some ways, this is called the birth of modernism. This is one of the key texts in that, the ability to see genre and see styles as these transient, limited things, but that becomes its own style, and we can look on that as well as a genre. I hope you've enjoyed this chapter. I'm going to go take a milk foot bath. I will see you in Oxen of the Sun.